Hello, my dears. How are you today? I hope things are going well for you. Well, today, Grandma wants to read you a story from a book that I had when my kids were little. You see that? It was 25 cents. It's about Paul Revere. Maybe you recognize that name if you know your American history a little bit. This is something that happened almost 250 years ago. There was once a man named Paul Revere who rode under the midnight moon. He knew he might never return, but he went riding, riding, riding for liberty because he wanted a country without a king, a country where all men could be free. Paul Revere was a silversmith in old Boston town. If anything could be made of silver, Paul Revere could make it. In his shop on Fish Street, he made teapots and cream pots, buckles and bows, and spoons and jugs and cups. We don't use too much silver anymore today, but back then, silver was a very prized thing to make your dishes out of. But on this April night, he left his shop. He walked quickly through the streets, keeping away from the king's soldiers in their red coats. You see those soldiers over there in red coats? Back in those days, the British soldiers wore red coats. And America wasn't America then. It was a British colony. Robert Newman was waiting for him, almost hidden by the shadows of Christ Church. The king's soldiers march tonight, Paul Revere said. They want to capture our guns and gunpowder and some of our men. I am riding to Lexington to give the warning, but the redcoats may stop me. We are to tell our men with lanterns how the British go, one if by land and two if by sea. Robert Newman nodded. I know the plan. I will show the lanterns from the tower of the church. Show two lanterns. The redcoats are going by sea, said Paul Revere. So the redcoats were going to get into their ship and go up the river before they attacked Lexington and Concord, because that's where they understood that the militia and the colonists were hiding their gunpowder and weapons. While Robert Newman started up the tower, Paul Revere hurried home. He put on his boots and riding coat and said goodbye to his wife and children. Good luck, father, said young Paul, his oldest son. Thank you, son, Paul Revere said. Now it's up to you to take care of things here, for there's no telling if I'll return. He was willing to give his life for freedom. Once again, Paul Revere went out into the night. With two friends, he went to the riverbank where he had hidden a rowboat. My spurs, he said. I've forgotten my spurs. How can I ride without them? Back in those days, they rode horses because they didn't have cars. And they had spurs on their boots to make the horses go faster, to do what they wanted them to do. Then he saw that his dog had followed him. Writing a note to Mrs. Revere, he tied it to the dog. Home, boy, he said. Home as fast as you can. The dog was back in just a few minutes, and tied around his neck were the spurs. Ah, that's better, said Paul Revere. See the spurs around the dog's neck? That was a very good dog, wasn't it? He'd get home and the soldiers wouldn't think anything about a dog running through the streets where they might notice a man and stop him. Getting into the boat, Paul Revere and his friends began to row across the river. Floating on the water was the ship Somerset. It was a big ship, the king's ship, and it had 64 cannons. Its lanterns shone out in the darkness like staring eyes. You see those lanterns shining from the ship? Paul Revere kept listening for the roar of cannon or the shout of a ship's officer, but he could hear nothing, and at last the boat touched shore. "We did it," Paul Revere said. "We did it, right under their noses." So the men are trying to organize to stop the British soldiers from getting their weapons and their men. Not far from shore, Paul Revere met some men. They led him to Deacon Larkin's house and gave him a horse. "You must be careful, sir," said one of the men. "There are redcoats on the road." Redcoats are the soldiers. "I will," Paul Revere said as he got into the saddle. "Well, gentlemen, I must be off." And Paul Revere began riding, riding, riding for liberty. Past fields and meadows, past orchards and farms he rode. Brooks and streams flashed by in the moonlight, and in all the world there was no sound but the sound of wind and the thud of horses' hooves on the road. So Paul Revere was riding to warn the men the soldiers were coming. Then ahead of him, he saw two men on horseback. Their pistols gleamed in the moonlight. "Soldiers," Paul Revere said, "redcoats." One of the soldiers galloped toward him, and Paul Revere cut across a field. Near a swamp, he suddenly turned aside. He smiled as the horse behind him crashed into the swamp, its hooves sinking into the mud. See, that soldier's horse got stuck in the mud in the swamp. Paul Revere got away because he turned. Spurring on his horse, Paul Revere raced to another road. Riding, riding, riding. He came to the village of Medford. He stopped at a house and pounded on the door. "Wake up," he shouted. "The redcoats are coming." At every house, all along the way to Lexington, Paul Revere shouted his warning. "To arms, to arms. The redcoats are coming." And this story doesn't show it, but other men were riding out too to warn the people that the redcoats were coming. It wasn't just Paul Revere, but this story is about him. He's the most famous one who went riding to warn the people to prepare for the soldiers. Everywhere, men reached for their rifles. They were Minutemen, ready to fight in a minute. Women ran to the swamps with their children. Church bells rang and drums rolled, for the redcoats were coming, and the time had come to fight for liberty. The people were willing to fight to have their freedom to choose how they wanted to live. They didn't want a king anymore. And when the redcoats marched into Lexington, the Minutemen were there before them. A shot was fired, and the battle started. And the battle was the start of a great war, the Revolutionary War. For years, the war went on. And when the war was over, there was a new country, the United States of America. It was a country without a king, where all men could be free. And Americans have never forgotten Paul Revere, who rode under the midnight moon, riding, riding, riding for liberty. And so this is the story of Paul Revere, but there were many other men who also rode to give the warning. And that was the start of the Great War, the Revolutionary War, that made the United States of America a country without a king. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And remember, Grandma loves you, and I'll tell you some more later. Bye.